We're live.
Good morning and welcome to Scholars Strike Canada 2022, Defund, Demilitarize, and Abolish Police, Prisons, and All Forms of Carcerality. I am Kristen Boss, and I am an assistant professor in the Department of Historical Studies at the University of Toronto, Mississauga, and Women and Gender Studies at the Women and Gender Studies Institute at the University of Toronto. I'm also Métis, born and raised here in Takaranto, but my homelands are in Northern Alberta in Treaty 8 territory, which means that I am here on this land as you might be as a guest.
And I'm Min Sook Lee. I teach at Yellowhead University.
We wish to welcome Serena Flowers and Susan Pacheco Carrera, our ASL interpreters, and Denise Agard, who will be here taking care of our closed captioning. For the next 3 days, we ask all faculty and staff to pause their teaching and administrative work and participate in our teach-ins online. We recognize that our sector is precarious. The majority of faculty teaching in colleges and universities today are contract workers with no job security. If you cannot join the strike action, we hope you are able to follow the teach-ins with your students. We invite you to use the teach-ins as your curriculum this week. We also invite all of you who are able to come out and join us as we gather this Wednesday, March 23rd at 12 p.m. at the intersection of Yonge and Gould at X University in the spot where the statue of residential school architect Egerton Ryerson fell last summer, to reclaim and mark spaces of refusal, resistance, and resurgence against settler colonialism, anti-Black racism, police violence, the prison industrial complex, and all forms of carcerality globally.
We'd like to begin by acknowledging that we're broadcasting the teach-ins for Scholars Strike Canada from Toronto, Takaranto, the sacred land on which we live, work, and organize. For over 15,000 years, this land has been home to Indigenous peoples who have lived and continue to live in relation with the land in ways that have proven to be ecologically sustainable, anti-capitalist, and vital to our shared future. We must honor our relations. This land is the territory of the Mississauga of the Credit First Nation, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat. Takaranto is home to one of the largest and most diverse Indigenous communities in what is currently called Canada. The very inception of Canada has been marked by the violent dispossession of Indigenous peoples and the brutal enslavement of African peoples. This place that is Canada is shaped and sustained by the ever-present settler colonial, racist, Islamaphobic violence that criminalizes and murders Indigenous, Afro-Indigenous, Black, and racialized peoples. Let's take a moment to recognize the ongoing struggle for Indigenous sovereignty that continues in this country. Land protectors continue to be targeted and arrested on their own territories, such as Anishinaabe Vanessa Gray, who was targeted at her home by Toronto Police Services and the Canadian Pacific Police Service, a private railroad police force in connection to a solidarity action for Wet'suwet'en in December 2021. This is part of a larger pattern of colonial violence in which the Canadian state collaborates with corporations to criminalize Indigenous land defenders, while continuing to dispossess Indigenous peoples of their land. Colonization is first and foremost about land, the control of it and the erasure of Indigenous peoples from their land. As scholars, artists, activists, and students, and others gathered here together, it is our obligation to be in relations with Indigenous peoples, the land, and with each other.
Today, March 21st, is the International Day for the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination and Racism as designated by the United Nations. The International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination was established by the United Nations in 1966 to commemorate the Sharpeville Massacre, where on this day, 56 years ago, South African police opened fire on women, children, and men, killing 69 people and injuring 180 others as they protested apartheid and its past laws. This year's programming was initiated and organized jointly by myself and Beverly Bain. We are so grateful to our programming committee, student supports, and our tech behind the scenes and design team. We are also grateful for our supporters who helped make our teach-ins possible. We are thankful to all of you who endorse Scholars Strike Canada and our labor action and are in solidarity with us. We would now like to take a few moments to acknowledge our allies in the struggle and invite them to say a few words. I'd like to introduce JP Hornick, Chief Steward of OPSU Local 556, Coordinator of the School of Labor at George Brown College, and Chair of the bargaining team representing 16,000 college faculty, instructors, librarians, and counselors. JP?
Hey, thank you so much for having me, and what an exciting thing to be able to participate in this Scholars Strike. One of the things that college faculty have been really focused on in our bargaining over the past 5 years, certainly, is a focus on creating that kind of social movement unionism and really building it into the marrow of everything that we do. And so we're fully supportive of what we're trying to accomplish here by recognizing those structural inequities that result in so many of the problems facing us in post-secondary institutions and the communities that we serve and work in and try and educate. And so this round of bargaining, we managed to box in our employer around because of a refusal to engage in actual change, the need to implement change around indigenization, decolonization, and truth and reconciliation, around like truly looking at equity in the way in which it's entrenched into institutionally in structural forms. And so those were the points of resistance of the employer, because they know that is where the power of students and faculty and staff together is rooted. And so if they have control over these processes, if they're structures that, are only there to reinforce the existing inequalities and the imbalances in power, that they can keep control rather than really get at the root of what the academy is supposed to be, which is a place for debate, discussion, exploration, and challenge of why. I mean, the one place where we have to make inroads around class, around race, around intersectionality is absolutely through education, because it's the one thing that you can't take away, right? So the more that this fight is front and center, and the more that we are centering the kinds of things that the Scholars Strike is intended to center in these discussions, and the more we build that into the collective bargaining, which is a necessary part of what, trying to move things forward, then the better off we all are. I mean, we see it in our area as it's all of us or none of us. And in order to do that, it means we have to have some difficult conversations, meet our people where they are, but also force them, forward the next couple of steps in order to get to where we need to be so that we're better off, right? Because this is the source of our strength. This is the source of our power. And if we don't embrace this now, in this moment, exactly this time where things are so difficult, then we've lost our way, frankly. And so I really thank you for having me in to talk about this. We just, it's been a heck of a fight, but it's really one that never stops, right? This is a journey, and we're making this road together in these forums, exactly. So I appreciate that. In solidarity, folks.
Congratulations, JP. That was an awesome fight you did.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, it's only because we know that we're all together in it, right? And so being surrounded and working with such amazing people is, it's a privilege, honestly.
Glad. We're also going to hear some words from Terry Malley, who I'd like to introduce now. Terry is faculty at York University and member of UFA's bargaining committee. Terry, would you like to say a few words?
Hi there, everybody. Yes, JP could have written my notes for me. Those are those are brilliant and exactly what we've been going through as well. I just want to say it's a great honor and privilege to be here as an ally, so many members at York support the Scholars Strike. Events and actions and ideas and movements, they're absolutely necessary at this time for all the reasons that JP mentioned with regard to her OPSU colleagues. I just wanted to mention a couple of things about that kind of follow from those remarks and some of the previous remarks and what's going to happen in the next couple of days. What we ran into in our recent round of bargaining, which we were somewhat surprised just ended last week about 72 hours ago. And by that, I mean, we weren't sure that we weren't going to be on strike as of this Thursday. It was down to the last minute. It took 6 or 8 months actually of bargaining. And the administration's response at York was no, no, no to almost everything, including the equity initiatives that we had, including making gains and furthering the rights and protections of BIPOC and Indigenous colleagues and junior faculty, those with disabilities, and a range of other colleagues at York. And it was a tough go. And what we ran into, I think, was the fact that in the process, the equity initiatives that many colleagues take to be so vital and so important exactly at this time ran into the corporate neoliberal university and its demands, the demands of the Board of Governors, and the constraints under which they thought they were working in order to produce an acceptable collective agreement from their perspective. That and this isn't just the case at York, but at many other universities, that on the face of it appeared to take into consideration some equity concerns and some other issues that are important to all of us here today in the next few days, but that really tried to balance those off with the more neoliberal agenda that the university is widely seen among colleagues to actually have, both financially, fiscally, in terms of the way the university operates and whatnot as well. So our bargaining really, I can't discuss some of the details just because we've got our members' ratification meeting this afternoon. And the vote over the next couple of days. And I don't want to prejudge that, but it's a situation where the struggles to decolonize the university, for example, are only moved forward, I think we've found, by pushing back very hard, by saying exactly what JP said, that we're all in this together, that all of this faculty, the students, and allies have an interest in furthering these issues in the university. But the only way to do that, and this wasn't just the case at York, it's been the case across the country, with, I might add, situations where there are conservative governments, right? And Lethbridge is still on strike. University of Manitoba went on strike in 2021. Acadia, I think, is still on strike now. UOIT, the Institute of Technology in Ontario, went on strike, all where they're conservative governments. Is that a coincidence? I don't think so. No. And the reason is because the larger concern and focus of those governments on equity issues is weak and very low. It's not their primary focus. Their primary focus is capital accumulation, the neoliberal economy, neoliberal governance more broadly, et cetera. And it does not have equity as a key focus, as a central pillar. And that's why I think in all of the provinces where you've got conservative governments, a lot of the faculty associations had to go on strike, or felt they had to go on strike, even with membership who weren't used to striking that much. As was the case at York, we hadn't had a strike in 27 years. But all of those issues came to the fore in terms of carcerality and the more disciplinary aspect of this. I mean, York is used to a certain tradition of strikes by the TAs local, QP 3903, and contract faculty local at York. And in the last round of their bargaining, the administration adopted a very tough line. In fact, went after, in a disciplinary way, in a kind of disciplinary tribunal process, 4 grad students and 3 undergrads. And scared the heck out of them when they tried to discipline them through a very obscure internal university process. Well, the students took the university to court and they won about a year later. And that was tossed out and deemed to be totally inappropriate. So the university can talk equity on the one hand, right, on one side of its mouth. But when it does things like that, or for example, in the lead up to in the course of our bargaining during the COVID period just last year, the York outsourced accommodations to a private, American-led outsourcing company that granted no accommodations at all. And this was an outrage. This was infuriating. And that's what I mean. Those are two examples of how the neoliberal university can, on the one hand, talk about equity, but on the other hand, without concerted action and organization and mobilization and pushback, hard pushback on our part, those things, they'll continue to engage in these other kinds of practices that primarily target and disadvantage BIPOC colleagues and students, students of color, women, faculty, contract faculty, et cetera. And all of those things were things we had to push back really hard and fight for. And what we learned this time, I mean, in the kind of dialectic, so to speak, was that in the face of that resistance and in the face of the university saying no for 8 months, until last week, literally until 72 hours ago, to almost all of our equity and other demands, what happened was the whole mobilization effort really brought people together in exactly the way that JP mentioned 2 minutes ago. It really brought colleagues and students together, departments, the union. It brought the union together, the UFA, that is, with those colleagues who aren't that UFA involved, who aren't that active in a sense, but everybody understood the moment and the importance of the moment and coming together in solidarity. And that's the only thing that moved the administration then to settle in a hurry, because they realized there was going to be a strike next Thursday, right? And it was going to affect the entire university. And the strike was about all of those social justice issues. So that's my brief report back, and you'll hear more about the details of the collective agreement, I'm sure, in the next few days once it's ratified and signed, if that's the case. And as mentioned, I just thank everybody, the organizers and all of the colleagues who participated in the Scholar Strike events, and we really appreciate your organizing them and appreciate being able to say a few words. But stand together. You have to push back. You have to be tough. You have to organize, you possibly have to strike, and we have to keep doing that.
Thank you, Terry. That was a really, really incredible encapsulation of what you faced at the bargaining table. And it was really interesting to hear you talk about the political efficacy of gearing your membership up to fight for what you believe in, to insist that you're not going to compromise on your demands. And I think UFA did an extraordinary job rallying your community for the impending possible strike action. I'm glad that you're not facing that. Congrats on coming to an agreement, hopefully that will ratify. But you really pointed out some of the strategies and tools that neoliberal academic administrators are using across this country, in fact. And we saw it played out in the worst way at Laurentian. And some of those Laurentian reps I know, were part of the York, bargaining team, and they're using the same playbook. So what UFA did, and what the 16,000 members of OPSU's colleges and college sector did, was push back, put out a very defiant collective voice that no, we're not going to stand for you watering down equity, taking and appropriating decolonization language, which they have done with their equity diversity initiatives that in many ways appropriate and accommodate to neoliberal interests and make decolonization meaningless in the mouths of administrators. I have literally seen administrators at OCAD gut our library and say, oh, firing 4 senior librarians is a decolonial move. And we're seeing that repeatedly, how the language and the politics of our movements has been appropriated by administrators, and they have in many ways used it to make these words duplicitous and meaningless. And we need to call that to account and to be really clear about what we stand for. And I think UFA did a fantastic fight in making sure that equity, decolonial language meant something. It's not a metaphor. And also refusing to be divided, because we've seen administrators do that, try and pit equity against class initiatives. And we're doing this under Bill 124, where salaries are capped at 1% in Ontario. So that was an extraordinary fight that UFA led and OPSU. So congrats and thanks for coming to the first day of Scholar Strike Canada to give us greetings, but also to give us a report. And once again, congratulations, Terry. Awesome.
Thank you.
Awesome work.
Thanks, Minzer.
Scholar Strike Canada was launched in September 2020 by scholar activists and organizers as a labor action to protest brutality and killings of Black, Indigenous, and racialized people by police in Canada and the US. It followed the Black uprising that took place in Canada, the US, and globally that demanded police be defunded and abolished. The global uprising has disrupted the mainstream acceptance of policing and has sparked challenges to the future of policing that felt unimaginable only a few years ago.
Since Scholars Strike 2020, the backlash from Canadian policing institutions has been vicious but predictable, as police budgets keep growing and violence continues apace. Police in so-called Canada shot and killed more people in 2021 than in 2020, and many more died in police custody. We call out some of their names. Anthony Oust, Moses Arehi, Trent Firth, Lionel Ernest, Braden Herman, Julian Jones, Jared Lowndes, Sheffield Matthews, Dylan McDonald, Coco Ritchie, Latour Toole are among those Black, Indigenous, and racialized people killed by police or who died in police custody since the last Scholars Strike. Here, as well as in the US and globally, we also acknowledge, remember, and hold close the missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, Two-Spirit people, and trans women, all of our relations and valued community members. We acknowledge and condemn the ongoing anti-Asian racist attacks, including the 8 lives lost in the Atlanta shooting, and the ongoing anti-Muslim racist and Islamaphobic attacks here and globally. As recently as Saturday, a man with a hatchet and a spray used to repel bears attacked worshipers at a mosque in Mississauga. As we call out their names, we acknowledge the many names that we do not know, and the ongoing ability of the police in so-called Canada to kill people whose names are never known to the public.
Our virtual teach-ins will bring together scholars, activists, artists, and students doing work on land defense across borders, harm reduction, defunding and abolishing police and prisons, global extractivism care and accountability, cops off campus, and pandemic policing. We're going to begin today with our first teach-in, moderated by Beverly Bain of Scholar Strike Canada, titled "This Demands an Abolitionist Reckoning: Racism, Fascism, the Convoy Protest, and the Global Expansion of White Supremacy and White Ethnonationalism." This teach-in will begin momentarily. And if you're in Takaronto, we hope to see you this Wednesday at our Day of Action, the Takaronto Abolition Tour 2022. Check out our website for more details about the Abolition Tour. Miigwech.
Let's see you soon.
Um, Rajan.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I can just want to make sure I can see everybody. I want to be able to see everybody. Okay. Hi all, welcome. I see Rinaldo, Courtney, Gary, Harsha, Yasmin, all welcome. So we can all turn our cameras on now. So I can, if that works for people, we should turn our cameras on.
Okay, we're unmuted.
What? Morning, everybody. Well, now it's noon. Good afternoon. And we're going to get started. We're just waiting on, ooh, this light is kind of weird. We're waiting on, gotta show up my bow tie here. I mean, it's, there's a reason for this bow tie. gotta show it up. Oh.
It's been so long since I last saw you, Yasmin.
Okay, so we're good to go, Rajan?
Yeah, we're good to go. I think just Kevin.
Just Kevin. No, Kevin is not going to be here today. So we're good. We have everybody who's on the panel today. Okay. Rajan?
Yeah, you're good to start.
Okay, I'm going to start now. Okay, welcome to our opening teaching titled This Demands an Abolitionist Reckoning, Racism, Fascism, the Convoy Protests, and the Global Expansion of White Supremacy and White Ethnonationalism. Good morning to all of you. Good day. It's midday and welcome. We have ASL and we also have closed caption. And we will also be opening up for questions later on. Today, our esteemed panel will help us talk through and think through the recent rise in the ultra-right white ethno-nationalist movements we are witnessing globally, accompanied by the rise in fascism, racism, and Islamophobia and xenophobia, right? We will also discuss what the context of this is for our struggles, Indigenous struggles, migrant struggles, Black protests, anti-racism, and other struggles that are taking place in this country. And you will hear from our panelists how we should be engaging in this time in relation to the context we are living in. I'll begin now with the introductions, and speakers will speak in the order of the introductions. Gary Kinsman of No Pride in Policing Coalition, an author of the Canadian War on Queers, National Security as Sexual Regulation, along with other works. Courtney Skye, writer and research fellow at the Yellowhead Institute. Yasmin Jawani of Concord University, an author of Discourses of Denial, Meditations on Race, Gender and Violence. And of course, other work. Rinaldo Walcott, University of Toronto, author of On Property and the Long Emancipation, among others. Harsha Walia, activist and organizer from Vancouver, author of Border and Rule, Global Migration, Capitalism, and the Rise of Racist Nationalism. Welcome, all of you. Thank you for being here. I'm going to ask you to begin with 12 minutes of your thoughts and reflections based on our panel. And when we're done with that round, I will give you an opportunity to engage with each other. And I will also pose some questions and we will together have a discussion. We will have about 5 to 10 minutes of questions that we will take from people who have questions that they would like to ask you. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome all of you again and ask Gary Kinsman to start us off.
Thanks. I'm really pleased to be able to be here. This, for me, is a really crucial discussion about racialized class struggles in pandemic times. And I, first of all, wanted to put a bit of a context in place. So in 2020, we had the global uprising for Black life and a major uprising against the police. To fund and abolish the police became mass demands. Abolitionist politics became more popular and grew. We'll talk a little bit more about the response to that in the last session of this teach-in. In 2021, we had added to this no pride in genocide regarding the genocidal practices engaged in by the Canadian state and Canadian social formation against Indigenous people, especially regarding the residential death camps. But in early 2022, we had something else happen. We had a right-wing, white supremacist convoy take over downtown Ottawa for close to 5 weeks. And we had a series of border blockades at Coutts in Alberta and at the Ambassador Bridge. This really did steal the show for the early months of 2022. Now, I want us to sort of reckon with what this actually means for us and abolitionist politics more generally. From their vantage point, that is the vantage point of the right-wing white supremacist fascists, what they actually engaged in was tactically brilliant. And this is one of the reasons why I actually think the arguments that some people, some liberals and some leftists mobilize that they're just stupid, these people, is actually like not a very good way of approaching the topic. They were allowed to stay obstructing, and as some people describe it, occupying downtown Ottawa for, as I said, 5 weeks. Part of this was because of the active collaboration with the police. And of course, the police are also a right-wing white supremacist organization. And if other people had actually engaged in similar activities, whether they were Indigenous people, Black activists, or encampment supporters or housing activists or leftists or whatever, they would have been dealt with very differently by the police. So for 5 weeks, the convoy became the focus of mainstream media attention. They managed to shift official politics in their direction. Now, the convoy was not really organized around the issues that they said it was organized around. It was actually organized by many right-wing, white supremacist, and overtly fascist groups and networks, including the Canada Unity, People's Party, Yellow Vest Canada, Maverick Party, the Soldiers of Odin, and many others. They were able to develop a mass base for their types of politics, ranging from more active supporters to more passive supporters. But nonetheless, they were actually able to grow a significant mass base. They used fascist tactics within the general context of racism, white supremacy, support for settler colonialism, and anti-Semitism. For instance, they instilled fear and terror among the people that they occupied or interfered with in downtown Ottawa. And that included the terror of attacking people with wearing masks, especially Black and Indigenous and people of color, people wearing masks. So they used terror tactics. They used the instilling of fear as one of their central tactics. They also took action rather than just talking about things, which is a central fascist tactic. And they also polarized the situation. And that's one of the fascist tactics as well. And they don't necessarily care if they polarize it so that everyone supports them. By polarizing the situation, they know they will get some people on their side and they will actually be able to expand their influence. So we now have to deal with a situation in which there are thousands and thousands of supporters who are not all hardcore fascists, but are able to be mobilized by various white supremacist and fascist organizations. That's something that didn't really exist before. So we've got to come to terms with that. They've even managed to appropriate the term freedom as an individualist abstraction and steal it away from Black and left movements who have used that expression as sort of like a core part of our organizing. In relationship to COVID, and I want to underline this, they achieved most of their objectives, right? I mean, it was never really about the mandate passports in terms of transportation to the United States. And of course, they've achieved these objectives with the new increasingly official policies around COVID, that COVID is supposedly now endemic, that we can supposedly just learn to live with it, which is, on a eugenic approach that renders disabled, elderly, immune compromised, Black and people of color and poor people as expendable. And I think that's really the stakes of what's happening right now. Now, how did this take place? Well, one thing that needs to be noted is neoliberal capitalism and what it's actually done to notions of social and collective responsibility. I was an AIDS activist involved in AIDS organizing in the 1980s and into the early 1990s. And one of the things that we organized around was actually getting people to understand that engaging in safer sex and safer drug use practices, safer practices more generally, was actually a community and social responsibility. And it was actually pretty effective in terms of doing that. But the reworking of that, the undermining of that by neoliberal capitalism has actually produced this notion that people only are individually responsible. They also took advantage of the space that was opened up by the inability of our own social movements, unions, and the left to develop a virus suppression strategy based in community organizing and popular education. Instead, most of the so-called left, and we can talk about what that might mean in the discussion if people want to, actually sort of became the left opposition, if you want, or the left flank, more precisely, of the official sort of public health edicts that were coming down in terms of COVID, right? And the mandates that were coming down. So they ended up supporting financial efforts from the federal government and other state agencies that largely were about making profit for capitalists and for continuing the relations of exploitation of precarious workers. And it also relied, in a certain sense, on the profit rates of the pharmaceutical corporations. So what I'm trying to suggest is by not having a clear critical alternative to what state and public health officials were telling us, this actually opened up space for the right wing to move in and for right-wing white supremacists to move in. Now, one of the arguments that has been made, and I'm sure this is a common one that you experience, not only in climate justice organizing, but around the pandemic as well, which is just follow the science, right? Which of course undermines entirely our understanding that science is always historically transitory and always socially organized. But for instance, many of the public health edicts have actually been based on what I would actually characterize as very faulty notions of science. So for instance, stay at home, which was early on put forward as a major strategy, actually doesn't work. And of course, doesn't recognize that there's lots of people who don't have homes and that homes can actually be very, very dangerous to cis and trans women and to queer and trans youth. Another sort of argument that took them so long to accept, and some of them still don't accept, I'm talking about public health science, that COVID is actually transmitted in an airborne fashion. It's taken, some of them still don't recognize that. So talking about just follow the science doesn't actually work here, and actually sends sort of a elitist message to lots of people that it's those people who we can't possibly understand because they're scientists who actually have the truth, and that through grassroots and community organizing, we could never actually arrive at some of this knowledge ourselves. So even like notions of flattening the curve were based very clearly on some people being rendered expendable. So we didn't really have a critical approach to what state and public health agencies were offering, and this provided a real opening for the right wing. Now, how are we going to turn this around? Because I didn't want to just be pessimistic. I've also wanted to talk about alternatives and how we can actually organize to turn the situation around. And I decided, since there's no one from Ottawa on the panel, that I would actually talk about some of the things I've learned from people in Ottawa. So early on in the disruption of people's lives in the downtown of Ottawa, networks of people providing mutual aid, caring, and providing safety for people began to develop. This was absolutely crucial in terms of the response to white supremacist, fascist incursions into their lives. Eventually, after a lot of pressure, the unions finally started to move, and a march through the glebe of thousands of people was actually organized. The very next day, on February 13th, a dog walking group and some people from the Punch Up Anarchist Collective blockaded a reinforcement convoy that was coming from Cornwall, I believe, with all sorts of supplies for the convoy. And they started off with only a couple of dozen people, but it grew to more than 1,000. And this was like a very successful form of direct action and showed that community people could actually stop the right-wing white supremacist convoys. This became known as the Battle of Billings Bridge, and there's various writings now that have been done on the battles of Billings Bridge, but I think it's actually something really important to learn from as a very successful direct action that actually turned the tide against the convoy, showing that communities could actually take action and stop it. The next week, more marches and community blockades were planned. And it's in this context, and I think it's important to underline this, that the Trudeau government declared the Emergency Act, which of course was entirely unnecessary. The police already had powers to deal with this if they wanted to. But it also set a very, very dangerous precedent for Indigenous Black encampment activists, housing activists, all sorts of social justice activists who are organizing other movements and protests. So it was really horrible that they used the Emergency Act, which makes it easier for them to use it again. And they didn't need it at all in any way, shape, or form. What the battles of Billings Bridge and the community organizing in Ottawa showed us was that direct action could turn the situation around, and that we actually need to build grassroots, community-based, anti-racist and anti-fascist abolitionist movements that do not rely on the police in any way, shape, or form, and do not rely on things like governments enacting emergency acts, but instead rely on community organizing, on popular education, and also direct action to block the right wing. Now, the abolitionist reckoning, to come back to the title for this session, is that we actually need to act to undermine white supremacy and fascism right now, and to initiate transformative movements that dismantle the coercive and repressive arms of state relations. And that's, for me, what is actually at the core of abolitionist politics. We don't wait till so-called after the revolution to get rid of coercive aspects and carceral aspects of state relations. We act now to undermine and dismantle them, and to, in their place, build caring alternatives that actually address people's needs. So that, for me, is sort of part of what we need to talk about in terms of the abolitionist reckoning, which is to recognize that abolitionist politics actually provide the basis for building social movement, anti-racist alternatives to official public health ideology, to all of these types of practices, and that we need to tie together our campaigns against the police and carceral injustice and the prison system with campaigns against white supremacists and fascists. And by doing that, I think we will build a stronger movement for all of us, and also make clearer the alternative visions, the alternative dreams that we are putting forward in terms of building a new and totally different type of society. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Gary Kinsman. We move now to Courtney Skye. Welcome, Courtney.
I'm just going to share my screen. Awesome, thank you. So I'm going to explore some of the ideas and some of the work that I've done in understanding Haudenosaunee law and understanding my roles and responsibilities as a Haudenosaunee woman. And so this is an idea and a concept within our law that talks about how land claims us in our bodies. And so the relationship between how our bodies are intrinsically connected to specific lands and territories. This is my family. We're a matriarchal society, and so I just wanted to share with folks some images of my own family. My grandmother's grandmother, Mary Jacket Hill, my own grandmother, a hereditary leader within our traditional governance system. This little baby in the corner is my grandmother, Ione Anderson, who went to residential school at the Mushwell in Brantford, and then in the center, my mother and I with my nieces. And so we as Haudenosaunee people believe that we were placed here by our creator, And so many of our stories and histories are tied up in this idea that we were put here for a specific purpose with specific instructions on how we're supposed to relate to the land, but that every other living being also was placed here with the same specific instructions for themselves. And so when we look around ourselves, we see plants, we see animals, we see waters, we see the sun, we see all of these things of creation every day when we wake up, and we're thankful for that because they too are carrying out their original instructions. They are doing what the creator set down for them to do, whether they be strawberries or fish or the maple trees that their sap has begun running. They're all living within this, and it's conceptualized as this earth that we live on as being on the back of a turtle. And this symbol here of the tree, it's a great tree of peace, and that tree, and it's telling about how that tree came to stand and exist on this turtle's back, carries with it all of our laws and kinship and how we relate to one another. And so this is where I come from. I come from this very dynamic history of Indigenous people and Haudenosaunee people that have a breadth of law and history that has taken, my entire life to begin to understand fully and be able to act upon it. This is our traditional territories where it's tied to. This area within the pink is the Haldeman Tract. It's 6 miles on either side of the Grand River that was promised to the Haudenosaunee people following the American Revolution, that was promised to us forever by the king of the time. But our broader territory extends beyond this to this area between the three lakes. So Lake Huron, Lake Ontario, and Lake Erie, this area talks about how our hunting territory extends within these, and we have harvesting rights within this broader area. And then our broader traditional territory also extends down into the US, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Wisconsin, New York State. And so we have a really broad geographical territory, but the Haldeman Proclamation speaks specifically to this one river and tract of land. This is the source of the Grand River. This ditch between these two farmers' fields is where the beginning of our river and where we are tied to in our relationship to this land. And it's about 300 kilometers long from the mouth to the source of the river. And so I wanted people to kind of ground themselves in what actual lands we're talking about, because oftentimes when we have discourses, there's a very philosophical, I think, approach to how we talk about land and discuss it. But for myself, it's very tangible spaces. These are the ditches between farmers' fields. There are the small rivers that run between our territories. And they're areas where municipalities are setting themselves to develop our territories without Indigenous consent or without local consent of the people. And so for Haudenosaunee people, there are places of resistance like this. This is 1492 Land Back Lane. And you can see from this photo that the land is just the raw clay. And this is the clay that we're made of. When we talk about this land claims us in our bodies, or when we talk about our relationship to the land, our creator in our worldview made our bodies from this clay, and they shaped our bodies from this clay. And now as Haudenosaunee people, we are here in these places of resistance where developers and unwanted development strip every plant and animal and every form of life from that land. And then we're just left in this kind of raw relationship with this earth that is harmed and depleted, and our body is still having the same impacts of that colonization upon us within our spirits and within our families, within our clan families. And so we see these places, we see where this is happening now. And we see these things like the reclaiming and the destruction and the reconstruction and recreating that happens within the space, right? We see these tailing ponds and all of this, the ways the watershed was disrupted, the way the creeks through this area were disrupted, but also tearing down of monuments and Egerton Ryerson's head, which now resides at 1492 Land Back Lane. We see these spaces as resistance of bringing in conversations around how our land displacement leads to disruptions in our communities. This is Norma General. She's a woman in our community whose granddaughter was murdered and was missing, and her body was found a few months later, she'd been murdered while she was pregnant, and the father of her child killed her. And instead of hiding these traumas, instead of ignoring them, I think our places of resistance become spaces where these conversations can happen, where our harmed family members can come for healing and safety and celebration and uplifting, as opposed to being silenced and told to just get over it, which is something that Indigenous people are told over and over again. We also see the use of injunctions within these areas. So we're talking about the ways white supremacy changes and are used. Injunctions are a tool that developers and third parties can use to then co-opt and enact police violence. So developers can then go to through civil court to speak with the justices and then receive orders against anyone, Jane and John Doe, to suppress Indigenous existence on their territories. And through the use of injunctions, police violence is then leveraged by developers and corporations to displace Indigenous peoples. And this has happened over and over again to the Haudenosaunee people at Grand River, whether it's Gunestado in 2006 or Lamback Lane in 2020, or tomorrow when Foxgate Developments will be returning to court to seek another injunction against 1492 Lamback Lane. So these are just more pictures of Lamback and the ways that our communities have used kind of similar tactics to rising white supremacist movements, where road blockades and road closures have been used as a part of our resistance as well. And certainly there was no need for special police operations to enact police violence in our communities then, when this was the simplicity of the blockades that we had in our territories. Again, this is Skylar Williams here at a Wet'suwet'en blockade, a solidarity blockade that happened earlier this year. So this legacy, this history, it's always existed. And I think this is important, that we're not just talking about new ways of resistance, we're also talking about inheriting the history of resistance that Indigenous people have engaged in. And that resistance, I think, is really important because we draw strength from that, and that this is a part of systems that have been imposed on us. And it's not because we failed to modernize, it's not because we are somehow deficient in some way. It's because this is a system that's created by past policies that exist within this white supremacist framework that allow for our dispossession from lands and economic resources, but also through our political institutions. And so this is from Kevin Gover, the Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs, but talked about we're accepting an inheritance of the racism and inhumanity, but we're also accepting its legacy and the moral responsibility of putting things right. And so I hope that people are here to gain constructive feedback or constructive thoughts around how we're actually going to take on this moral responsibility of putting things right. For me, the main point that I wanted to bring to everyone's attention today is how I believe the federal government is misapplying Article 18 of the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And so for folks that might be engaged in Indigenous discourse or aware of some of the issues that Indigenous people have been encountering, Article 18 talks about our right to participate in decision-making through representatives of our own choice. And so what's happened is through the longstanding implementation of the Indian Act, which was forced on communities in the early 1900s, often through the use of police violence, RCMP violence, the arrest of hereditary leaders, it's become normalized that we see this imposed structure which embeds white supremacy and displaces our own laws and our own traditions and our own governance systems. We see that being held up in our communities as somehow legitimate, which solidifies our loss of territory and confinement to reserved territories. It doesn't allow us to conceptualize our territories and responsibilities beyond reserve boundaries, but it upholds these Indian Act leaders and the Assembly of First Nations, regional authorities like the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs or the Chiefs of Ontario, that they leverage state power in order to make decisions for our territories and our peoples. And then we see territories like the Grand River and the Haudenosaunee and the Wet'suwet'en, who have hereditary leaders still, come into conflict. And so we see the state completely and entirely platforming and empowering one system, providing them all of the access to state power, whether it be the authority to make laws under the Indian Act or all of the funding that reserve receives. It's funneled through one channel. And then we see our hereditary leaders who are entirely systemically disempowered, and they're put side by side and said they have an equal place at the table to negotiate and determine what our future will be and what representation looks like, ignoring the entire dispossession that's happened, but also the fact that this kind of imposed system only has legitimacy because the state is reinforcing it. So, and this is what's really important, because when we see these systems that are recreated or kind of modern or agreements or modern applications or reimaginings of what replacing the Indian Act and what does that look like for our communities, how is that actually happening? We have to make sure, and we have to be incredibly critical of them at every point in time, because they are embedded within white supremacist ideas. They are uphold white supremacy. The entire point of reconciliation is reconciling and affirming Canada's authority within Indigenous communities. That's how the law has been applying it, right? Is that Canada has an assumed authority, whereas Indigenous nations have inherent authority, and reconciliation is about solidifying and maintaining Canada's assumed authority with the inherent rights of Indigenous peoples. And through the many generations of colonialism we experienced, people are beginning to think, and our identities are changed, where we are seeing avenues to free ourselves, but we cannot do that because we potentially become completely colonized in our thinking because of how long these systems have been embedded and justified and legitimized within our communities. And so I want to say thank you. I do also want to spotlight 1492 Landback Lane. Tomorrow, Foxgate Developments will be in the process of seeking a second injunction against 1492 Landback Lane. This injunction was a tool that was used to entirely dispossess our people from lands and resources. There was over 50 people that were arrested in 2020 for either standing in solidarity or being at Landback Lane. And to date, about between 30 and 35 of those people have had their charges withdrawn by the Crown with no admission of guilt. And that today, March 21st, marks 610 days where Haudenosaunee people have been at 1492 Landback Lane. And there has still not been a reasonable effort by either the provincial or federal government to engage with this conflict and this longstanding conflict between Haudenosaunee people and the imposed Indian Act system, and the way that's created this conflict within our communities. They're just playing blind, being ostriches, putting their heads in the sand, ignoring it. And now we see the potential for this entire cycle of violence to be reinstated within our communities and at Landback Lane. And so here's some last points for people: ways to connect with me, ways to connect with Landback, ways to connect the work that I do with protecting the Haldimand Tract for Haudenosaunee people. There's social medias, and there's ways that people can support them financially. Thank you, everyone, and thanks for allowing me to be here today.
Thank you, Courtney, Skye. We'll move to Yasmin Jawani.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Beverly, for inviting me to this, and to all the people that are attending, and also my fellow panelists on this panel. I also want to acknowledge that I am on unceded Indigenous lands. So I will start with that. We have to, I think, begin to look at, and because my tendency is also to look at things sort of in a very structural or post-structuralist manner, is to begin to look at how, in fact, all of these different forms of extremism have, in fact, and a term that I borrow from Stuart Hall, a base grammar. They are actually tied together around this grammar. So what is this grammar? So before I even begin over there, I want to touch base on a number of different things. And I'm drawing heavily on an article that my colleagues Zainab Faruqi and David Anderson and I wrote for the conversation, looking precisely at this. What is the base grammar of extremism? And how is it connected to, even issues like defunding the police and abolitioning basically the whole system? So I want to go back to this whole notion of the kind of sort of environment in which we live. And I think it's really necessary to come back to it because we tend to sort of like focus on high profile events like the convoy, murders, for instance, or the killing of people, when in fact, all of this is supported by an inherent structure. And that structure is, made possible by this base grammar of race. It's a structure that is very much sort of propelled and moved around and has the kind of the affect that in fact sort of like brings everything together under this sort of like skin or realm of common sense. And it's this ambient racism that I want to focus on. The fact that it's there, the fact that it's basically permeating the entire structure. So that even when you look at, for instance, Gary mentioned, the sort of the public response to what happened in Ottawa and the galvanizing of that. That's also an affect that we need to look at. So what is it predicated on? And I think this is where I come in terms of this base grammar of extremism. So if I were to go back to Stuart Hall's amazing work, then one of the things about the base grammar of race is in fact that it's predicated on 4 kind of pillars, if you want, or 4 points around which the grammar sutures the language of race. And one of these is the idea of domination and subordination, those power relations that are then made possible by a kind of us versus them ideology. You have to position, they have to be superior, we have to be superior, they are inferior. And the final thing that I think is really relevant there is the naturalization of that difference. So everything is sort of imputed to nature as opposed to history. So it's not so much about, having, coming in and a secular colonialism, enacting the kinds of affect that are there, but it's more about, well, these people were inferior and we brought civilization to them. So, if we bear in mind these sort of like pivotal points around which this grammar is sutured, then I think we need to also then begin to unpack what happened in the convoy. How is it, for instance, that those occupiers, because I refuse to call them truckers, basically moved in and had a sense of entitlement where they could occupy the capital city in the country for 3 weeks, basically unfettered. So it's that sense of entitlement, that kind of sort of like ability to be able to move into those places, that white privilege that we begin to sort of like interrogate. What is it based on? So if I were to sort of look at this and drawing heavily from Zainab's work around Hindutva and Indian, sort of like the Hindu supremacy that's there, the key points there are, first of all, the focus on Islam and Muslims. So that's very much there. And I actually have, because I think what happens a lot of times is that when we're talking about stuff like that, like this, we're not really aware of the exact intensity and power of the kind of Islamophobic language that's used. So I want to quickly quote here one of the occupiers, who Benjamin Dichter, who this is his speech, because he was a former conservative candidate and a co-founder of LGBT Tory. He says, despite what our corporate media and political leaders want to admit, Islamist entryism and the adaptation of political Islam is rotting away at our society like syphilis. Okay. So again, the disease metaphor comes in. And it's this idea of contagious bodies that we now need to sort of look at. Which are the contagious bodies? So the way in which Hindu supremacy is identifying Muslims as carriers of these contagious diseases, as in fact contagion embodied, then sort of sets up a kind of response where, if we go back to the base grammar of race, it's this notion of ejecting from the body politic, from the social body, anything that's contagious. And I want to go back to the fact that this isn't just, it's Muslims right now, but if we go back historically, this is how the Chinese were treated. This is how other people of color have been treated, as in fact carriers of diseases. Underpinning all of this, or basically sort of like this, the thread that kind of ties everything together, that weaves it all together, is of course the conspiracy. And that conspiracy is about the potential replacement of the white race. And I bring that back because I think that there is something to be said here. King, as many of you know, has said this openly. He says there's an end game. It's called depopulation of the Caucasian race or the Anglo-Saxon. And that's what the goal is to depopulate the Anglo-Saxon race because they are the ones with the strongest bloodlines. Again, this is not new. If we go back to the empire, the daughters of the empire, this is precisely the kind of logic that was in place. This is precisely the kind of logic that was in place in terms of the sterilization, the mass sterilization of Indigenous women. This is exactly the same logic as my colleague Harsha will talk about in terms of the bodies that are permitted to cross the border because they are borders, and the bodies that are ejected. The bodies that, if they cannot be ejected, are actually contained and confined in detention centers in these places like that are made possible by the prison industrial complex. So all of these sort of comes back to this kind of grammar. And when we begin to unpack this grammar, then we can see, in fact, that it is ultimately a logic about that Foucault, drawing from the Black Panthers, actually had talked about, which is that society must be defended. Well, defended against what? And who is left to live, and who is allowed to live, and who is left to die? So when we figure in all of these things in terms of sort of a kind of the ways in which Indigenous bodies have been abandoned, the way in which the logic of genocide works, the way in which Black bodies are not allowed into the country, the way in which Islam is being used, then all of this sort of serves to make sense. And at the bottom of it is this grammar, which is very heavily based on the supremacy of one race. The able-bodiedness, I think, is really important. And the muscular, what has been called before, muscular Christianity, which was part of colonialism here, the settlement, but also in terms of the muscular virility. So the heteropatriarchy that is there at the bottom. So I think all of this sort of ties in together. And I want to sort of go back to something that Gary talked about, which is when we think about the convoy, who was in fact protecting them? The fact that they had so much money from people in the Canadian military, the fact that they were supported by the police themselves. So it's like underserved and underprotected is the way in which the police have generally dealt with Black communities and racialized communities. But here, what you're actually seeing is that kind of white privilege, white entitlement, and the ambient racism that ties it all together so that this logic makes sense. We need to get rid of them, right? Because they are taking away something that we had, a golden past, where we were superior, we were the rulers of the land. So I'll stop there and leave it open for discussion.
Thank you, Yasmin. Thank you. Next, Rinaldo Walcott. Can't hear you.
Sorry, I was still muted. Thank you, Bev. Thank you, Scholar Strike, for bringing us together again to try to address some things that feel pretty urgent to many of us. I'm speaking from notes, so I might not be as coherent as I would like to be, but I want to begin by saying that what I'm going to say today is very much premised by, sitting at home, hiding out from COVID, trying to be an aging Black gay man who survives COVID. And my comments are really very much structured with that kind of sensibility in mind. Because one of the things that it seems to me, of course, COVID plus death, plus Blackness, is bearing down heavily on many of us. But COVID plus age, meaning old age, and this disability, disposability, has come together to wreak havoc in our communities too. And as we notice that, many of us also not really accounted for the lives of already disabled kin living assisted, who've been living in assisted living, who've been disappeared from our conversations and discourses. So long-term care is not just for old people. It's for our disabled kin, many of whom have been deeply affected by this pandemic. And so, as an older Black gay man, literally trying to survive this pandemic and see if I can make it to the other side, I've been thinking a lot about the last federal election in Canada and thinking about how it is that not only that we had an election and re-elected a government, re-elected the current state managers who offered no big ideas of rethinking long-term care, of rethinking health distribution in the midst of a pandemic. But you put that alongside the fact that we also re-elected a prime minister who practiced blackface so many times that he himself could not remember. And we begin to see how COVID plus race, in my view, produces many of the contexts that we find ourselves in today in 2022. I would argue that there's a direct through line from Trudeau's blackface revealed exposure in 2019 to the convoy in Ottawa in 2022. That if you don't pay a political price for blackface at the Democratic representative level, you cannot be surprised that fascism comes into the streets. And so many of us in the Canadian state have to ask ourselves, how did we vote? Now, I don't vote, I don't participate in the representative Democratic state at that level. I think there are other ways to participate in it and so on. But those who voted for the Liberal Party in particular have a lot of questions to answer. And I think that when we begin to answer those questions honestly, many people are indicted. And so this is when I'm thinking about the question of the state managers and the state managers' relationship to the convoy, I'm saying that symbolically, the lack of a political price that Trudeau had to pay, that there was no particular individual within the Liberal Party who had the kind of ethical standing to speak up against Trudeau, that we already see within Liberal spaces, the Dear Leader syndrome. And the Dear Leader syndrome is deeply related to the kinds of actions that we saw on the streets in Ottawa, in Windsor, and elsewhere. So that's one set of ideas that I want to put on the table about the state. But the state and the university, as we all know, the university is an arm of the state, and it's a particularly significant arm of the state. I've been thinking about, so what is the relation, or what are the things that are bothering me about the relationship between COVID and fascism, and the relationship between COVID, fascism, the university, race, and what I'm going to call today activism, Inc. And I've been thinking about, the role that academics are playing in remaking this social order. I've been thinking a lot about public health academics and the complicities that we can see or hear every day on our television screens and on our radios. I've been thinking about how collections and collectives of Black researchers and academics and so on have really lost any kind of direction in terms of often a critique of the state a critique of racial management, critiques of class, and even gender, and instead have participated in certain kinds of public discourses that continue to blame poor and Black working class communities that have been literally denied access to vaccines because of how the distribution networks have been created, as somehow being vaccine hesitant, as somehow needing to be particularly intervened on in some way. And so part of what I'm getting at here is that there's a set of discourses about managing populations that are being distributed in ways across a range of different kinds of groups, community formations. And this is something I think we should be attentive to, because a lot of that discourse is emanating out of the university. So I'm glad that Scholar Strike has brought us together, because I think that there's something happening inside the University with Activism, Inc. that we should be really aware of and cautious about. I think there are a couple of things happening. One is that the notion of the scholar activist is losing its critical edge. That activism inside the university is becoming a new form of accumulation. And that we're seeing a certain kind of building of what I would call dismissively, a kind of activist aristocracy, where people are inheriting, you know, my mommy used to be a radical, so therefore I am. But what they're actually doing with that is they're building it into social, academic, scholarly capital. It is an accumulation not unlike the market accumulations that that our youthful colleague was pointing to in terms of negotiations with Royal University, and how market accumulations are structuring the senior administration, the managers, the senior managers' response to the union's collective demands for better working conditions. And I think we have to be really careful about the manner in which this kind of activism, Inc. inside the university is playing itself out. And I say that, and I say this with all honesty, I don't trust us. And that includes me. I don't trust us. I don't trust us. Like, we talk about ending precarity within the university, but I'm thinking that maybe it's not for us to end precarity. It's maybe that for all of us must become precarious. Which means then that opens up the question of what kind of risks different of us will take according to our own relationship and standing within the university. And I say that because I've been increasingly frustrated by looking at and watching how I think our struggles have been sold out in the university. What I call the Trayvon to George Floyd dividend, which has played itself largely out through the language and rhetoric of EDI or DEI, as you prefer. But what really is what I would call a kind of distribution of white superiority. That's what EDI is masking right now. It's a distribution of white superiority. And this ties back into me, the true line between Trudeau's blackface and the fascists, because I want us to understand that the moment that we're living in is that we can't think of fascism as being coherent. It is actually and literally not coherent in the way we imagine, you know, the 1930s to 45. The fascism that we're living with now is not a coherent fascism, but it does maintain two important components. White supremacy and white superiority is the glue of it. But that also means then that the fascism that we are witnessing and living can also be multicultural fascism, as in Priti Patel or Karen Burble Singh in the UK, right? And so that's why we could see Rastafarian black men in Ottawa, right? Because the fascism it is not coherent. And so, you know, every time, so bringing this back to university, what I see EDI doing, as I said, is redistributing white superiority through Black and Indigenous and POC faces. So every time I see us, and this is why I don't trust us, every time I see us celebrating Black, Indigenous, and POC people moving into the upper suites of management in the university, minus any rearrangement of the university. I don't trust us, because some kind of rearrangement of the university is the beginning to build the foundation for a possible abolition. So if we are celebrating non-white faces in the fancy suites of the university without any kind of rearrangement, we can't trust ourselves. Something has gone wrong. And so again, I ask, like, what are we going to be willing to risk? Each of us are going to have to think individually and collectively about the kinds of risks that we need to take to begin to build some significant foundations for rearrange the kinds of alternative imaginaries of life that Gary spoke about earlier. And so, you know, look, for the last 24 days, those of us, many of us who are not white, we have been told quite clearly, especially if we live in the West, that our lives don't matter. If the war in Ukraine has done anything in relationship to this kind of question of the incoherence of fascism, of the fascism that we live now, we can see how white retrenchment globally is finally being fully expressed, right? It's finally being fully expressed. It's being fully expressed through white superiority. So we don't have to get to fascism. We got to get back to talking about things like white superiority at the everyday banal way in which our social lives get organized. So when I say to you that, you know, this white retrenchment, it is liberal. It is not just the organized far right in Ottawa. It is liberal. It is the colleagues sitting in the office down the hallway from us. This white retrenchment is also anti-war, but it's anti-war in Europe. It's not anti-war anywhere else. In fact, it refuses to recognize that wars are happening elsewhere, right? CBC Radio has been shamed into doing piecemeal 5 and 10-minute reports now on Yemen and Syria. It is anti-war, but it's anti-war in Europe. This white retrenchment is called EDI. And so it was interesting to hear our youthful colleague talk about the kind of pushback, because yes, white retrenchment in this moment can also claim EDI. It can also claim equity, because it can use a very base politics of representation to say we've got not white people in the upper suites too. And this white retrenchment then is also about the reimposition of Europe's values as if they are the universal values. It is a deadly, deadly, deadly dogma. So I thank you. And I just want to repeat that the 21st century continues the color line.
Thank you, Rinaldo. And we'll now hear from Harsha.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Beverly. Thank you to all of the organizers of Scholar Strike. And thank you so much to the panelists. It's just such an honor to be alongside and to think alongside and to be here with you all today, and everyone who's listening in and participating. I'm on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish nations. And these are the territories that I'm speaking to you all today from. And I'm thoughtful, you know, especially today on the anniversary of the Sharpeville massacre, about those global continuities of violence, right? The ways in which South African apartheid borrowed from and was built and in synergy with the reserve system, the past system, the Indian Act here in settler colonial Canada. I was also reading this morning some news from South Africa, and I wanted to just bring into the conversation some of what the residents of Sharpeville were saying, because as we know, days of commemoration can often erroneously suggest that conditions have changed, right? That apartheid has fallen and conditions have changed. And today in the townships, what residents were saying at some of the commemorations were, quote, the pain of seeing the township where the atrocity took place with no service delivery, no clean water today, and where our graves are being used as dumping sites, end quote. And so I think it's, important to think through what commemoration means on days like these, and to think about those continuities of violence that persist. I wanted to today, in just the urgency of this moment, as everyone has highlighted, think about something that Paul Gilroy said a few years ago. And he said, quote, in one of his lectures, "I want to insist that this notable deterioration in our political culture and institutions cannot be understood without paying careful attention to the specific dynamics, both of race as a matter of political ontology and of racism as a variety of political speech. Race and nation are now primary sources of groupness and absolute ethnicity. They're supposedly endowed with a special power to restore certainty and find stability amidst the flux of precarious life in increasingly dangerous conditions," end quote. I want to take Paul's invocation seriously and think through race and nation in these times, in this context, with the urgency of the questions that Scholar Strike has posed. And, I think one of the things with the convoy that we see is, not only were they, for example, waving Nazi and Confederate and Gadsden flags, but also the Canadian flag, right? So we see how literally on the street, the Canadian nation state and the symbol of Canada, the maple leaf flags, were a way to restore certainty and stability in these times of the pandemic. And this idea of recuperating this lost Canada, right? The ways in which the nation state and race become a stabilizing force within fascism, as speakers have already articulated. So I want to offer that synergy, right? That there is no discongruence between the waving of Nazi Confederate flags and the maple leaf flag. And the sooner that we realize that, then the less kind of incongruent it starts to seem when we look at that through line, as Rinaldo called it, between liberalism and fascism. I also want to just put on the table, thinking through ethnonationalism, that very serious question that was put forward in this panel event, right? The rise of ethnonationalism, and how serious and urgent it is for us to think about the escalating social organization of difference, right? By which we mean the political, economic, spatial, social, everything processes by which race and class and more are created, reproduced, managed, and maintained. And white nationalism, as well as its handmaidens, whether it's Zionism or Brahminical Hindutva, which Yasmin talked about, and other aligned kind of ethno-nationalisms and supremacies that historically, contemporarily, always hinge on anti-Muslim, anti-Black, and anti-Indigenous racisms, are deeply ingrained, especially through racial citizenship and the modern nation state. And when we think about racial citizenship, how it's also anti-feminist, trans-exclusionary, and literally fascist propaganda, right? The idea that, quote unquote, civilization will be destroyed by feminists, atheists, Jews, multiculturalists, communists, and queers, that kind of screed that we see in a lot of right-wing propaganda really maps on top of the function of the border, right? That is exactly what the border does. So when we hear the far right talk about the destruction of civilization by quote unquote undesirables, we have to recognize that that is not just far right and right-wing propaganda. That is literally the tools of the nation state. That is what the nation state is built on, that the nation state has really reproduced and solidified the idea of undesirables and disposables. And we see this starkly at the border every day, in immigration detention centers every day, in temporary migrant worker programs every day, in communities that are made non-status every day. And we especially, of course, today see it at the borders of Fortress Europe, right? Where whiteness is again being, is in stark view in a way that is just not possible to be ignored. And so borders as a tool of containment to constrain freedom work both to bolster racial citizenship, the idea again of who belongs and who doesn't, and also racial capitalism through the exploitation of labor. And I think here, it's important to see the ways in which liberal multiculturalism and overt racist nationalism both share an assumption that Black and racialized communities and Indigenous communities are bearers of difference, right? And so in that way, state multiculturalism is organized to subtend, not dismantle, racial power, specifically white supremacy. Sarah Ahmed wrote, quote, "Strangers are not simply those who we do not recognize, but those whom we recognize as strangers." And I think this is key, because while liberalism may challenge so-called negative stereotypes attributed to the so-called stranger, it still assumes and imbues meaning in the recognition of certain people as strangers, right? So the categorization of who is a stranger, who is an outsider, even as it may be supposedly tolerated through multiculturalism, commodified inclusion, et cetera, it still consolidates state governance specifically as racial governance, right? Which is exactly that, that connection to ethno-nationalism. During the pandemic, just returning, to this specific moment, in the pandemic, we know that the pandemic has exposed so many fault lines, right? So many existing fault lines that have come to light and are, again, so starkly obvious. And the ways in which the issues of vaccines and vaccine mandates have been weaponized by the convoy protests in Ottawa and elsewhere. But also specifically, as Gary talked about, the ways in which even the discourse of freedom has been weaponized. So freedom now to mean a specifically anti-Indigenous, anti-Black refraction of freedom, freedom to mean a deeply individualistic, ableist, fascist articulation of a kind of settler colonial freedom, also of a capitalist freedom, right? Opening up the economy as the kind of central node of thinking about freedom. And so we see here, as Robin Kelly suggests, that this neo-fascist movement of today, though it's different from the 1930s, is ruled by fear, but still governed by neoliberal reason, right? And so we see the ways in which that neoliberal logic is imbued in this far-right movement. And we see it in the makeup of the far right and the convoy protests, from everything we know about the analysis of their GoFundMes, their donations, and who was actually there. It was mostly small business owners, gym owners, restaurateurs, et cetera. And that it wasn't explicitly of truckers, right? We know that it wasn't actually, most of the participants were not, in fact, truck drivers. We know that, in fact, most truck drivers are vaccinated. We know that most truck drivers, particularly those who are South Asian, for example, the majority Punjabi South Asia, Punjabi truck drivers were vocally opposed to the convoy, and in fact made clear that the systemic issues that they were facing were actually wage theft and violation of their labor rights. And many were in fact impacted by the border blockades because they weren't able to work when they were prevented from doing their job, right? So we know that in this case, the main driver of the far right in Ottawa specifically was not a working class movement generally, right? And Gary also talked about the ways in which the broader left, the broader left becomes a bit of a generalization, but if I may, it didn't actually organize a response this whole time during the pandemic to the neoliberal agenda of the state, which was also deeply individualistic, right? All the kind of pandemic measures, whether provincially or federally, were deeply individualistic, were non-collectivist, were anti-worker, were harmful to disabled and aging and immune-compromised people. We had measures that entrenched the policing of the pandemic and surveillance with the kind of final escalation of the use of the Emergency Act. And internationally, so important, we have the entrenchment of global vaccine apartheid that continues. So we see, again, those continuities of violence, particularly when we're looking at the framework of apartheid and disposable life and structural racism. The other kind of responses that I wanted to touch on specifically in thinking about us as the left broadly here again, is how there's been this resurgence, if you will, in the left of needing to tend to the white worker, right? In as much as white workers may not have been central, but were implicated and were present in the convoy protests in Ottawa, but also, distributed locally and all the different kind of support demonstrations that happened for the convoy. I really want to suggest some caution in this thinking and the identity formation of the white working class, right? Which we know even the kind of identity of the white working class, even in the left, is an explicit antagonism to a multiracial class identity. And it uses the modality of race making at the expense of all working people, right? To fixate on the white working class person. Stuart Hall reminds us that race is thus also the modality in which class is lived, the medium through which class relations are experienced, the form in which it is appropriated and fought through. And this is important, not only in order to build a genuine multiracial working class movement, but specifically because in recent years, and of course historically, the ways in which the discourses of catering to the white working class really dovetails into a far right articulation of the white working class that is deeply racialized and nationalist, right? The kind of discourse of, for example, immigrant workers are stealing our jobs, or stealing our services. In this case, the articulation becomes that the primary victims of austerity and neoliberalism are the so-called white citizens, right? The white nationalist citizens. And so it's a pernicious kind of form of white supremacy on the left today. And I think that's, specifically the animation of the working class along racial and nationalist lines. And it's conditioning increasingly class through racial citizenship. And it's been at the detriment, really, of building a robust left. And again, it actually feeds into the right? Because it leads to the intensification of vicious ethnonationalism while maintaining an elitist status quo. And we see this around the world, for example, with Brexit movements and more. So the kind of nostalgia for a union, wage-based, Fordist industrial economy ignores how such an economy has always been subsidized by both colonial extraction and the racialized, gendered, low-wage service economy. And an obsession with analyzing the exaggerated trauma of the white working man ends up reinforcing patriarchal whiteness. It invisibilizes the disproportionate impoverishment of racialized women workers, and specifically undermines anti-racist feminist leadership in class struggles as we're trying to fight back against the far right. I think the second kind of less left, more liberal response, but that we need to be thinking about, is that kind of response that comes up every time, right? Which is, this is not Canada, which ignores the ways in which the far right movements on the street and the liberal state are linked. The liberal state and the liberal government and far right populism are deeply linked, which Rinaldo has already talked about. And so we need to push back against this idea that liberalism will somehow be an effective and ethical counter to the far right. The third thing that I wanted to talk about is, we have to also resist the kind of responses that we're seeing, which is that a bolstered carceral state will somehow be an effective counter to the far right. This response that if the police would just do their jobs, if we gave the cops more money, if we put more money into the carceral state, that will be the ways in which we mitigate or we crush the right, if you will. And of course, in this moment, moments of abolition and abolitionist reckoning, of Black-led abolitionist uprisings, we have to be very clear in rejecting this, right? And assuming that the police can respond to the far right, and rejecting the idea that more money for police are appropriate responses to the rise in hate crimes during the pandemic. So resisting specifically the idea that anti-Asian hate crimes, for example, can be resolved through the police, or even resisting, as we saw in the last 2 years, the idea that putting white supremacists on anti-terrorist lists is an effective response, right? So we had that happen a few years ago, where there was a move to add certain white supremacist organizations onto Canada's terror list, as if though the terror list is not in itself a fundamentally racialized concept, right? And so we have to resist all of these kinds of responses that bolster the carceral state and that will see the increase in policing power as a response to the far right. I wanted to end by just cautioning around, in my view, I may be completely wrong, but something that I'm thinking about and incredibly worried about, which is the ways in which the rise and, these kind of waves of fascist far right power will escalate, and that's eco-fascism. We see the ways in which climate catastrophe is escalating. We know this, and the specific ways in which now climate security discourse is being used to really bolster borders in particular, right? Climate militarization. And we've seen far-right movements, like the Christchurch killer said, quote, "Continued immigration into Europe is environmental warfare." The El Paso killer said, quote, if we can get rid of enough people, then our way of life can become more sustainable. So we're seeing this rise of eco-fascism in every, in far-right movements and liberal movements. We know that there's an escalation of border militarization. And I think we really need to be looking at the ways in which eco-fascism in particular is going to be, the kind of nascent and already is convergence of so many forms of fascism, while at the same time, attacks on Indigenous people who are stewarding their lands is escalating globally. The horrific murders of environmental land defenders has doubled over the past 15 years. So also thinking about those impacts. And in conclusion, as people have already said, the ways in which we build an effective counter to the far right, is a rejection of liberalism, is a rejection of the return to normal, is a rejection of the status quo. But it really is an internationalist vision that is opposed to racial capitalism, that is opposed to white supremacy and all its tentacles, that's opposed to all forms of structural oppression, and that really is built on care and solidarity and mutual aid and world making. And that's the kind of horizon that we have to constantly orient ourselves towards. Thank you all.
Thank you, Harsha, and thank you, everybody. I mean, this was a really robust conversation. I mean, there were so many pieces that came together. And I just want to just say, a couple things, and then I'm going to let people have a bit of discussion, because I'm looking at time as well, and I want you to have some time to talk to each other. But what has actually been made very clear is that we can't think of the Convoy protests and the rise of ethnonationalism and the rise of the far right in isolation, of what is happening within the context of state or universities in terms of its investment in a liberal kind of discourse, in terms of, the way in terms of a biopolitical discourse and a biopolitical practice of who belongs, who doesn't, who deserves to be here, who doesn't, who deserves to live, who deserves to die, as we see in terms of the way in which all of this is coming together, the way that Indigenous people are no longer visible and have not been visible as in the context. They are seen as already gone, dead. We're seeing the way that biopolitics is working, and the way in which we're seeing how white supremacy, racism, and the alt-right is a global movement, and how that actually, is actually taking, is coming to fruition in a particular kind of way. And when we look at the way in which, as Rinaldo himself mentioned, and other people have mentioned, in terms of the war in Europe that is happening, the war that is happening between Russia and Ukraine, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And we see the way in which the discourse of, civilization, the discourse of, what is understood as a just war, even though, we don't necessarily, we are here that people will not support wars, but in Europe, there is a certain kind of justification for the protection of white lives and white bodies. And that we cannot in any way engage in these conversations and engage in moving forward if we are not willing also to dismantle, these kinds of liberal formations that we continue investing, corporatization, capitalism, neoliberalism, and imperialism, white imperialism, that continues to undermine the lives of racialized people, in the world. And I want to actually throw out and ask people to talk about and to kind of refine in a way a little bit more what are our next steps. I mean, I heard different pieces of what, like Rinaldo says, we have to be willing to take risk. We have to be willing to consider abolition. Harsha tells us that, we have to, pay attention in terms of what's happening at the borders and the way in which, you know, bodies are actually shaped at the borders and continue to be shaped at the borders. The way that a real fundamental thing is in terms of class politics and the way that, you know, the labor movement itself and the way that white workers and the way that class politics operate in such a way that actually eliminates the fact that the work are carried out by migrants, the work are carried out by racialized bodies, who are actually bodies that are expelled from the nation as well. So I want people to hear people talk a little bit more about how do we then start pulling these pieces together? What is it that we need to do right now in order to actually create an abolitionist future, a livability, a way to move forward in terms of our lives? And I don't know who wants to start. Okay, Gary, do you want to start?
If you insist. I mean, around where to start. I mean, I did offer some suggestions in terms of what I said before, but it seems to me that two things are absolutely crucial. One is that we actually reject the notion of class politics put forward by much of the white left, because it's actually not relevant to the experiences of actual working class struggle anymore, because it sort of seems to, it's built on this assumption you can somehow separate out race and settler colonialism from class. And also to begin to understand that what's important about class politics in some major ways is how people act, right? So for me, like the Zapatistas in Mexico are actually a working class movement, not necessarily in a strict sociological or orthodox Marxist sense, but in the sense that they're actually obstructing capitalist extractivism and development. And one of the major social forces within the so-called Canadian state obstructing capitalist so-called development are Indigenous struggles of various sorts, land back struggles, Wet'suwet'en, and so on. So that's one thing. And the other one is to also begin to understand the relationship between liberalism and all of these problems that we're talking about. Because, you know, I mean, and also I think to some extent we actually have to take up the types of arguments that get mobilized. Like the argument's not only this is not Canada, right? That gets put forward, but also somehow like stand with Trudeau, which, you know, you can find on Twitter all over the place, right? To begin to understand, as Rinaldo was pointing out, what are the links between liberalism and fascism? And I also want to suggest that we actually have to put to rest the reliance of some parts of the so-called popular left on just follow the science, right? You know, it's not going to work around climate justice because they've known for decades what they're doing to the planet. They don't fucking care about most of us and most of the species on the planet. They care about making profit and for their individual survival. And it certainly doesn't work in the context of the pandemic, when there's all sorts of debates over what the so-called science is, when the public health interpretation of that science has been so devastating in so many people's lives. And I think that the other thing I just want to say, it has to be global, it has to be internationalist, as Harsha was saying, and it has to put borders in question and challenge them and defy them and break them down. I think I'll just leave it there, and other people can offer their observations.
If I may?
Yeah.
Yeah. I agree with much of what Gary just said. When I'm thinking about this idea that we've got to take risks, and we've got to ask ourselves what are we willing to risk? And that should really be, I know that I said collective, individual and collective, but that should really largely be a collective question. You know, I'm of this position that since '89, the fall of the wall, that the left internationally has cannibalized itself. That the left, you know, and this might sound, but the left has fallen into a kind of identity-based politics, which is not identity politics, but an identity-based politic that literally does not allow it to have a coherent position in relationship to a whole bunch of kinds of issues. So instead, what we get management by race, management by sexuality, management by disability, right? And in each of these groups that claim to be distinct from each other, then we get interconnecting warfare, because then the Black people are like, but we're disabled people too, and we're queer people too. And so we're never able to formulate the kind of responses to the issues that are shaping our lives in the way that the right and now the far right and the multicultural fascists and so on have been able to do. Like, Fortress Europe is not by happenstance, right? It's because people were able to forge a particular discourse that as Jasmine was pointing out via Stuart Hall, that at the base, that has a base grammar from which they can move. Post 89, the left has lost any kind of base grammar from which we can move. And we are involved in an interconnecting warfare with a certain kind of activist aristocracy that sprouts a lot of stuff, but moves us in nowhere. I'm not an organizer, so I'm waiting for people to organize me. But I read and I think that that's what I can bring to the table when people organize me. And I see the left seems incapable of doing that. The left seems incapable of organizing and bringing as many people as we actually should be able to bring to the table, to the streets, and so on. And so, Gary, when you said, popular education, I'm definitely there with you. What happened to when we used to knock on our neighbors' doors and talk to them about the issues of the day and try to convince them that we and them should stand together in solidarity around. So there's a kind of way in which, we can do that with all of the technologies that we have at our fingertips and disposal, right? So the kind of question then from that is, what kind of risks are we willing to take to make that happen? For someone like myself, and I'll shut up after this, I spent all of my adult life either as a student or a professor in the university. The university has always been a site of political struggle for me. I've always understood the university to be deeply intertwined in the kinds of struggles that other people say take place on the street. I went to school in a department where, was largely understood to be feminist and radical, but there was a guy called Ted Harvey who was doing research for the police union, right? And at the same time, his wife was the president of York University, Lorna Marsden. Ted Harvey and Lorna Marsden, they were shaping something and helping to shape something. And so I always understand the university to be this site of immense political struggle. And one of the things I see happening in the university is the university has become skilled from our struggles, from what I call the Trayvon to George Floyd dividend, in selecting for us people who look like us, or people who claim to share some with us, to racially manage us, to manage us through gender, to manage us through sexuality, and so on. And one of the things that we have to risk is we have to refuse that. And we have to refuse that really, 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 really loudly. And that means that we're going to have to come into conflict with folks. We're going to actually have to name folks. We're going to actually have to say, you selected that person to be vice president of this, or you selected that person to be on such and such a board. And we know that that person cannot represent the kind of interest that you claim you're selecting them for. And we're going to have to name it. We're going to have to be explicit about what it is that we want. And we can't say, oh, well, it's a South Asian woman, so, it's misogyny if you speak out against this person, right? Because that's how the left has been totally, and I speak from a position, I inhabit this position. That's how the left has been totally defeated.
Okay, I want to go to Yasmin, because Rinaldo said something around about the base, the left has no base grammar, and the way, and one of the things that Gary has said, and you yourself inferred as well as Rinaldo, is the way in which political language, such as freedom and other kinds of languages that the left and activists have actually engaged with, have been usurped, have become really instituted within, the university, as Rinaldo says, within the institution, become part of the management way of ruling, or as Dorothy Smith would say, part of the relations of ruling, is that they have now become those particular things that have been liberalized and have become part of the neoliberal, context. And I'm wondering what you see in terms of the way we should be thinking in terms of how we start to speak about, what is happening today.
Mhm.
What kind of language? What ways should we be thinking and actually recreating in terms of how we speak about what's happening politically, so that we can actually start, reshaping what has already been, usurped.
Okay. I'd like
And
to
is that a
answer all
possibility
of,
at all?
I'd like to answer all of that, but I think Courtney wanted to say something first because she'd sent a message out saying she wanted to go next. So Courtney?
Oh, sorry, Courtney. Courtney, do you want to go next, please? I didn't
Yeah.
see the message.
Oh,
I'm
okay.
sorry. My apologies.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Sorry. Yeah, thanks. I wanted to just react, or I guess respond to what Rinaldo was speaking about when it comes to risk. And I think it's really
Right.
important because it's, we're talking about risk, we're talking about what we're each individually willing to risk, but what collectively we're willing to risk. And I think for me, I definitely have for myself recognized the fact that it is important to understand what's happening. It's important to understand these dynamics and the history and contextualize them and understand kind of the theory behind them, but that doesn't preclude action, and it doesn't preclude who are leaving on the streets to do the work for
Right.
us. And so there are so many
Right.
people, and we talked about the way that
Right.
class becomes entrenched in our movement, and there are so many people who occupy positions of privilege that have access to institution support, whether they're tenured or whether they have permanent jobs or whether they have benefits, in ways that they are not willing to risk that comfort in the same ways that people on the streets are risking that comfort. And so I think that has been really important to me, because the work that I do, I'm a researcher and I do policy work, but the idea that that can't happen on the ground is also the way in which we reinforce oppression against our own people, right? So for me, it was really about, I had this position or this connections to all of these privileges of the institutions, but I wasn't going to leave my cousins and my family and people that I've known my entire life to face police violence at Landback Lane. I wasn't going to leave them to that. And I was with that community, and I was on the ground with them. I maintained and was able to do my work because I had a community that supported me, but also because I had, I was willing to risk all of those connections. And so all of the things that I have at my disposal, whether it's presenting on CBC, whether it's having access to writing or publishing, all of that, I'm treating it as it's my last chance to make an impact, because I do not value my place within those systems over my place and accountability to my own community. And that is something that I think Indigenous communities have really been able to work through and think through in ways other communities haven't, where we think a lot about kinship and accountability to one another. And I've learned through my own personal experience that taking these really brave risks and steps with my career has translated into a deepening of the relationships that I have with my own family and my own networks. And so I see a lot of the discourse that's happening, a lot of the conversations that are happening for younger people, especially, it can become very overwhelming. And they think that they have to become masters of all of these theories and topics before they can act. And I want to, dispel that myth here, that everyone can act no matter where they are, whether or not they understand these things or not, whether they understand every word that's spoken here today. They can act, and they can go and they can use their own internal sense of what is fair and what is just, and use that to guide them, go in to start building relationships, and then make mistakes and build and grow through them. Because I think that's what happens, right? I see a lot of people who are frozen from action because they were worried that they have to be able to have perfect discourse and engage in perfect conversations before they're willing to stand on a front line somewhere. And when we do that, we leave people on the front lines without support and without care. We see people like Skylar Williams at 1492 Lamback Lane. He's a union iron worker. His family, like, they didn't go to post-secondary. You know, a lot of our movements are organized and staffed by people, or like are maintained by people who got high school equivalencies, who didn't ever go to the university. And without them, all of the privileges that we have are not possible. You know, that frontline resistance is the catalyst that everyone else is able to drive and work from and organize around. If we're not holding those lines on the front line and on the ground, then everything else kind of falls apart behind it. And so you know, Rinaldo talked about being organized. Like, you actually have to go and find those people who are organizing and stand behind them and push them forward and help them and platform them and support them in whatever way you can, because otherwise we're just leaving people who are already vulnerable to fight these battles and fight these and engage in these conflicts, and then sit back and be like, well, I'm policy, and policy isn't on the front line. Or I'm a writer and writing isn't on the front line. All of those things are on the front line because the white supremacist institutions that are there will kill all of us regardless of where we're sitting, whether it's in an office or in a university or in a car on the side of the road in a blockade. So I just wanted to make that connection for everyone.
That is powerful, because that is significant, because one of the things that you're saying here is that, and it's critical, is that, I mean, you know, I remember, as an activist, and I wouldn't take too long, but as an activist for over 40 years, I mean, we've always done all of the things that, you know, Courtney has mentioned in terms of doing our own documentation, doing our own collection of our own data in terms of what was going on around police violence or around violence against women, you know, in the women and racialized and Black communities. We've always done that. And that has never been a separate aspect to that in the academy, right? It has been, you know, it has always been work on the ground, has always been critical. And what has happened is that we're seeing, you know, the way that a lot of this kind of work has become institutionalized. That has that's been happening for decades now, right? And become institutionalized in ways that actually loses, you know, what is actually, you know, the sort of solid groundwork of what people do every day and how they are on the front lines every day, continuing to fight, right? So I'll give, we're at 1:36, and I wanted to hear from Harsha and Yasmin. You can decide who wants to go, and you know, so we can wrap up. And so Harsha, you'll go, or Yasmin?
I think you're muted, Yasmin. You were talking. Go for it.
Muted. All right. So I just wanted to sort of like take off from everything that Courtney said, because I know that with some of us that are in the academy right now, we came in at a time of incredible struggle when we as people of color were not even considered to have the intelligence to be able to step in and to take those roles. So having gone through that kind of war and seen, in fact, what the institution represents, which is white supremacy at its, you know, at its pinnacle in a way. But I wanted to go back to something that Courtney said, because in a way, and it's kind of references what you said, Beverly, it's how did we come along? How did we survive? Because we're looking at major institutions, and this is something that Harsha talked about. You know, the birth of capitalism, the Industrial Revolution, the white supremacy has its roots in that, and every other kind of supremacy that there is, which is killing people everywhere in the world. So how did that? Can we actually stand up against it? Even the left is born of the same thing. Mm-hmm. So how can we even stand up against it? And it's saturated everything. So it's that kind of sort of, it's the ambient racism that I talked about. It's pervasive. It is there everywhere. Okay. And through kind of global imperialism, it has spread around the world and sort of, I say, give birth to all other kinds of nativistic movements, right? That have taken that. So my only sort of like hope in of going forward. And one of the things you talked about is what kind of language can we begin to use to sort of like unbury, if you want, or excavate what is happening. And I think it's the language of power. We really need to be aware of the language of power and its machinations. But more than that, I think the only way that we have a hope, that's any kind of a hope, is to go back to looking at tactics versus strategy. So if we think of this entire capitalist system, the whole sort of like prison industrial complex that it has given birth to, all of these institutions of white supremacy, then in fact, what they are strategies that are being put into place to manage populations, to extract labor, to extract profits, and so forth. The only other counter to that, I would say, is tactics. It's kind of like if we look at the war that's happening right now, the very war that is really entrenching a white supremacist mentality by excluding people of color. In that, we can actually see as the theater of war, what are the Ukrainians doing? What are groups like Anonymous doing? So where are the tactical sites of intervention? We cannot, there's no way we can dismantle this whole system. I really don't believe we can, because we're too saturated. This is our common sense world as well. But the way that we can is to systematically strike at different points, kind of like what the work that Courtney does, the work even Rinaldo you do in terms of writing, the frontline work that Gary and Harsha do, the work that you've done, Beverly, and do in the classroom. These are the only tactical sites that are open to us.
Harsha? Thank you very much, Yasmin. Harsha?
Thank you all. And thank you also to the ASL interpreters. Thank you so much for interpreting our very fast speed, amongst other things. I think, yeah, just to really echo what everyone has said, I think a big piece of it, in my view, is really rejecting liberalism. I think there's a tendency to turn towards liberalism, particularly during moments of the rise of the far right. It can be easy to grasp to. It's seen as a counter, the kind of stand with Trudeau, Gary, you were talking about, Rinaldo, you were talking about. And I think we have to get clear on that, because in moments of confusion, I was actually surprised at how many people I saw who were supporting these kind of liberal responses. And so we have to reject all formations of it. I'm not in the academy, but I'm in the nonprofit industrial complex. And so I'm also worried about the rise of the EDI kind of industry and how that mitigates actual struggle and manages struggle. And so I want to echo that, because it's deeply worrying the ways in which it appropriates the language and morphs into something else, right? Into a new kind of politics of representation that's hollowed out of meaningful attachment to struggle. And I mentioned earlier, I think, one of the things, and we're in this moment where so many people are thinking through this, but I think we really need to hold on to it because it can wax and wane, is really thinking about the carceral state. In moments of neoliberalism, it can be easy to have this interpretation that neoliberalism means the state is like withering away, right? That's like an often left analysis, that the state is withering away. If we look at public sectors, right? We look at the care economy, we look at public services, but that of course doesn't look at how the kind of carceral state has always grown within neoliberalism, right? Police budgets, et cetera. And right now we're seeing that, in the context of defund movements, police are still getting money. And especially now, the ways in which the far right becomes a bludgeon to argue for more police funding, right? We need to fight hate crimes. We need to fight the far right. The kind of the ways in which different provincial governments are using and weaponizing police budgets to really attack Indigenous frontline struggles and land defense struggles, right? So I think we always have to have that lens of the ways in which the carceral state is not actually withering away under globalization, right? And that's a common left kind of misinterpretation, I think. Being internationalist and really seeing, like I was politicized in the 90s, and the local is the global really resonates with me, like when you fight in your neighborhood against gentrification, that means understanding that this is part of an international struggle. And I think, to echo what Courtney said, we don't have to understand it all. in its nuances and all the facts, but we can understand that we're in struggle together, right? And most frontline communities understand the injustices of the world, even if you don't have a shared vocabulary for it or a shared understanding. But the idea that we are planetarily in struggle, like that there is mass injustice in this world, and that we are in this struggle, I think is something we need to return to in terms of our role and how the world is shaped through these continuities of violence. And maybe the last thing that I'd say is really just collectivist coalitional politics. I think one of the corollaries of EDI is this weird idea that we individually can be social change makers. Like I've been to a lot of organizing training, schools and workshops that have really highlighted the individual social change maker. And of course, we all have a role. We all have a role in this ecosystem of struggle, but we can't do it alone. And so to the struggle of coalitional work is part of the struggle, right? Like how to be in struggle with each other and alongside each other in a ways that doesn't simplify difference or collapse our different social locations, but still finding a way to organize together, right? That this is inherently a collectivist struggle, that we have to envision something new or past, however we define it. I think about the return to that a lot, and maybe that's my particular vantage point, which isn't in any way, again, to say that we don't all have our own self-determination with it, but that we have to be thinking about coalitional collectivist politics in the ways that rejects that kind of liberalism, and always oriented towards freedom, and also tactically always thinking about what kind of strategy is a non-reformist reform, if you will, to borrow from critical resistance. And what are the steps that take us towards that horizon for freedom in a way that is really about building collective liberation, right? For all of us, and not for some of us, but that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I think abolition is one of those kinds of struggles and focus that we need to continue to, move forward and to push forward in terms of how we actually start dismantling carcerality. So thank you all. This was amazing. I mean, I wish we had more time to continue this conversation, because it's been a brilliant, invigorating conversation, and it required another hour at least in order for us to really pull things out. But I think we managed quite well. And Courtney brought something to our attention, which is that the Ontario government is making emergency tools permanent to stop blockades. And we know that, of course, would continue to penalize Indigenous blockades against the invasion of its territory, but it would also penalize protests, Black protests, Black uprising, and other protests against, against racism and other forms of gatherings to protest racism and other forms of, oppression in this society. So we see that and I mean, I think we knew this. We actually did say that we knew that this particular emergency act, the list of emergency act that was established, was going to work towards undermining a lot of the struggles that we have been actually, waging in this country. So again, clearly, and for what everyone says, the struggle continues, and the fight has to actually, really, we have to push forward. And on Wednesday, the 23rd, we will be gathering together, at Gould and Young, and we will be doing a march through the city to mark the sites of resistance, titled Reclaim Abolition. And I'm hoping that everyone would turn out, where we can actually take that space. And that's in Toronto, unfortunately, for people who don't live in Toronto. But if you're in Toronto, please remember, please come out and support the strike, the protest. Thank you very much, all of you. And thank you to our listeners or viewers. Coming right up is Erica Violet Lee, Neha, writer and community organizer based in Saskatoon, who's going to do some poetry and reflection for us. Thank you all. And please stay tuned for the rest of the teach-ins.
I'm going until...
I think it's 15 minutes.
Got it. 10 now. Tanse, Erica Violet Lee.
Hold on 1 second. I'll give you a note. Okay, you're live.
Tanse, Erica Violet Lee, Nehioen, Misaskotomanek, Egwa PSO, Oasis Nitotsen. My name is Erica Violet Lee, and I am happy and joyful and thankful to be here today with so many people that I admire and consider friends and solidarity workers in the struggles that we face across these lands. I'm coming to you today from inner city Saskatoon in Saskatchewan, Treaty 6 lands. And this is where I grew up. This is where my communities lie, some of my communities. And this is where I write a lot of my poetry. So I guess I've recently started calling myself a poet, which seems like such a lofty title to take on. But whenever I think of, I think poet suits me better than academic, I'll say that much. But whenever I think, oh, poetry can be so silly, it can be so meaningless, it can be so almost excessive and arrogant in a time when we're facing so much as people, when we're facing so much as workers, as Indigenous folks, as Black folks, as trans, queer, and two-spirit people, and as poor people. But there's a Christos quote. She's a Menominee Native American poet, and she says something like, I contend that any poetry that tries to play itself off as not being political is actually harmful, because all poetry is political, whether or not you're writing a poem specifically about politics, whether or not you name abolition in your poem. So all of my poetry is toward the idea of police and prison abolition. That's where I write from. So the first poem I'll read to you is called Freedom's Flight, and I wrote this for my friend Mito. In her dreams, she flies fast through the city with no IVs attached to her arms. In her dreams, there's a grocery store that serves wild berries and fresh, thick wild meat stews. Everyone takes what they need, and there's always enough. In her dreams, there's a community center that never closes. You can go there to bead and hear stories, to get healthcare, or maybe just a locker for storage. In her dreams, you get vaccines and don't have to worry about whether the government might be experimenting on you, or if you will leave the hospital unable to have babies because they didn't ask your consent before cutting you open or sewing you up. The thing about sickness is that it puts life in a suspended state. They say life, really living, will happen again after the recovery. But for those of us who live in a state that doesn't let us rest, being a good, productive citizen has always been a myth. They fill our heads with inspirational quotes about success and doing it now, about conquering the world. But some of us simply do not have the energy to do it now, nor do we wish to conquer anyone. So when you say conquest, I echo back to the concrete. No, we have never been conquered. Living with a disability, sickness, or madness makes the colonial demands of the city clear and unavoidable. The hostile unbreathability of its air to our lungs, how the air of the city is made unbreathable for our lungs, how the city's architecture is violent to our bodies and lives.
Have you seen that viral video of the cockatoo tearing up anti-bird nesting spikes with its small beak? This brings into clear relief all the disruptions to be made. There are so many beautiful disruptions to be made. No one can survive on flower petals or poetry alone, but we all need a place to nest, so we might as well make our freedom fragrant and delicious like lavender. They lock us together in these ghettos and cages and make us fight for food and shelter. Here we still live. Here we organize. The next piece I want to read is called The Battle, and I wrote it for Colton Bushy. It was storming in the Battlefords after the bail hearing. I remember the smell of the rain on grass. I remember being in love and how the men with guns on rooftops were tiny, kneeled in comparison to the prairie sky. This is why I have faith in the ways we have learned to love until it's more powerful than the verdict of any judge, more powerful than any courtroom, more powerful than any queen, any piece of paper, any all-white jury, any killer walking away, until our love is more powerful than any prison, because crowns rust and paper rots and genocidal civilizations end. And genocidal civilizations end, and genocidal civilizations are ended. When we die in the process, our bodies go back into the earth. They become the clouds in the ocean. Kayas, a long time ago, in the spot where the courtroom now stands, a politician talks with a farmer about what he's heard around the fort. Asks, do you think their dances can really make it rain? I'm going to finish because I think we have only a few minutes left, but I wanted to finish by starting these couple days of events with a poem by Corey Cardinal, who was a friend of mine. This is Corey, who passed away last year, and he was a prison and prisoners justice advocate from inside the walls. I remember the time he told me that he had an article I had written on Indigenous feminism pinned to his prison, the wall of his prison cell. And that never left me. And he was one of the best organizers I've ever known. So I wanted to read one of his short poems called Where the Wild Sage Grows. I dream of perfect places and peaceful mornings. I walk in endless fields of wildflowers, willows and sage. I belong to the uncharted wild land and untamed prairies of blooming flowers where the wild sage grows, unafraid of dying, free and blowing in the wind, growing where it pleases amongst the majestic buffalo and antelope, in the spirit of freedom and the grace of beautiful wilderness. I let myself fall and am caught by the birds that grasp my spirit and carry me away to perpetual bliss. I am home. Corey, this is for you. Kanana Skomitan for your time.
Thank you, Erica. Thank you very much. And Erica Violet Lee will be reading again tomorrow for a longer time. Thank you.